Great, so it looks like everyone's settled. So hi, welcome to our first Tux member presentation of the fall 2017 speaker season. So for today's presentation, it's my great pleasure to welcome two colleagues of mine from Ryerson School of Media, David Bouchard and Steve Daniels. David and Steve are both new media artists and technologists who work at the intersection of art, computation, and the physical environment. So they've worked together on a number of projects and also both teach in interactive art, new media, and technology courses in Ryerson's new media program. David's work focuses on exploring the expressive potential of computation in both software and hardware forms. He attempts to challenge the boundaries of design through multidisciplinary projects that cross art, social sciences, and engineering disciplines. His interests in research range across data visualization, generative art, responsive environments, digital fabrications, wireless sensor networks, among others. And his works strive to create playful encounters, encourage wonder, and shed new light on familiar objects and places by revealing hidden patterns. His clients have included the Canada Film Centre's Media Lab, the National Film Board, Siftio, Gorbit Design, Interaxon, among others. And he completed his undergraduate studies in computer science at Concordia and graduate studies at the MIT Media Lab. Steve uses electronics and communication technologies to create things like hardware agents, kinetic sculptures, and network events, and is also interested in the non-utilitarian possibilities of do-it-yourself or DIY social devices. His works juxtapose disparate knowledge systems and experiences in an attempt to reveal their underlying structures and assumptions. Steve has presented and exhibited his works at Future Sonic, the Ontario Science Centre, the Ottawa Art Gallery, and the Bay Area Maker Fair, among others. And he was also a recipient of the InterAccess Emerging Artist Award. Steve graduated from OCAD's Integrated Media Program after first completing his graduate studies in zoology and behavioral ecology at the University of Manitoba. So with that, please join me in welcoming David and Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks to Tuxedo for the opportunity to join you today, and thanks to everyone for taking this hour out of your lives to come and hang out with us and hear what we have to share with you. Today we're going to talk to you a little bit about some of the collaborative projects we've been doing as strategies to engage our students at Ryerson in thinking about the kinds of things we teach in the classroom and the sorts of artwork we kind of hope they aspire to when they graduate. Looking out at you, you all look, I'm going to be polite say more mature. I think you're mostly grad students in this room. Is that a safe assumption? Grad students, a few undergrads maybe? Okay, so our student body is primarily undergrads, and I'm just going to have, for those of you who are in more advanced degrees, kind of keep that in the back of your mind when we start talking about the ways and strategies we're using to engage students. We're going to talk a little bit about ourselves really quickly and then sort of get into the heart of the topic. We've got 4 projects we want to share with you today and use them as case studies for thinking about different relationships. Have the arrow keys. Sorry, not my laptop, and it's really hard to change slides when they're behind. There you go. There we go. So that's me. Here's just to give you a little bit of a visual sense of the kind of work I do when I'm working on my own. My creative practice deals with, as Ali indicated, working with hardware agents, kinetics, and robotics. I do all of the material work, programming, as well as design kind of considerations in these pieces. So I tend to work alone when I'm developing my own kinds of projects and working in these spaces. I work a lot with digital rapid prototyping tools, CNC mills, laser cutters, 3D printers, and that sort of thing. So a lot of my practice is sort of grounded in material space and thinking about ways to bring those potentials out into creative experiences for people in the art gallery. The primary place that I distribute my work then is in gallery spaces rather than, or festivals, rather than other kinds of contexts.
Thank you, Steve. And this is some of the work that I do. Ali's already done a great introduction, reading my bio. This is my portfolio, deadpixel.ca, and I'm interested in lots of different things, ranging from software to hardware. However, today's talk is not going to be about our work, as interesting as it may be, but more about collaborative work, so I will just move on from that really quickly. I thought I would tell you just a little bit about where we come from, our program at Ryerson, in case you haven't heard about it, just to give you some context as to where this is taking place. This is just a screenshot of our Instagram feed. We're very active on Instagram, so those of you who are using this platform, we post on there very regularly. So what we are is we are a 4-year BFA, a fine art degree program at Ryerson, which is not really famous for being an art school, so we're in a little bit of our own art bubble there. And we are a program where we play with art, science, and technology. That's kind of the driving theme. So students have courses in programming, physical computing, in addition to more traditional media forms like video, sound, digital media, and so forth. Our primary sort of overarching idea, I think, for the program that sets us maybe apart from other similar programs is, so regardless of the courses students are taking, we're kind of interested in training students to become 21st century thinkers. And what that means for us is really getting students to think about creative ways to solve problems and becoming very adaptable. So being able to quickly learn new technologies. So we're less interested in the specific tools that we teach them, but more about how do they learn these tools and how will they survive this rapidly changing world after they graduate from our program. So that's kind of our main approach. And because we're an art program, we try to infuse students with this artist's approach to solving problems, which many of them take on to other disciplines afterwards. Very few of them actually become artists, and they'll move on to work in fields like HCI, computer science, marketing, and so forth, and all kinds of different areas. So this is where we come from. Now this talk, going back to the topic, we're going to talk about ways in the last I would say about 5 years, we've been starting to think about ways that we can engage our students through these larger scale public collaborations. And so that's going to be our overarching theme, sort of seeking student engagement beyond the classroom. And the story kind of begins with the creation of our makerspace. I will hand it off to Steve.
We're not going to switch off every 2 slides for the whole talk. We just want to give an introduce. Hope we're not making you seasick. As David mentioned, the narrative for us begins kind of in academic year of 13-14 when we launched a makerspace inside our school. Like many media schools, we already had television studios, sound studios, big computer labs with lots of places that people could play with digital tools. But we did not yet have a space where students could have a focus site that they could go and think about interaction or tangible media or rapid prototyping. So to actually produce a makerspace that could support some of those different aspects and avenues of exploration was a really huge sort of jumping off point for us. It gave us a central place. It's 24/7 access for students, so they can be in there anytime they want to be working on their projects. And it gave them, for the first time, a home where these sorts of idea spaces could be explored collaboratively. At the end of that academic year, we were sort of reflecting on how the space was used and the ways it was getting adopted, and an opportunity presented itself. One of our alumni, Nick Paggi, who graduated in 2013 and was at that time the curator of the TIFF Kids Digital PlaySpace. Has anyone ever heard of the PlaySpace? Do you guys know what that's about? Okay, so the TIFF PlaySpace happens in conjunction with the TIFF Kids International Film Festival, which happens in the winter. The Adult Film Festival just closed a few weeks ago. And one of the things they do in conjunction with this film festival is hold a massive digital playground targeted at kids from about 3 to 12 years old. And a part of that exhibition space includes what they call the title wall, which is a massive media event that sits in the foyer of the TIFF Lightbox and lives for the duration of the festival. And the festival is really interested in creating interactive spaces on that wall or some sort of responsive experience for audience. Nick had recently learned of the amazing and brilliant Michael Elizabeth Scott. I'm not sure how many of you might have stumbled across her work before. Mike is a technologist and an artist based in San Francisco, and she had recently done this crazy piece as a part of the Burning Man Festival. And inside this was this crazy cloud that sat on the end of a crane, and it could rain on you and change colors, and you could play with it with your cell phone and do all kinds of stuff. The part that was really interesting about it for us is she had developed a technology called Fade Candy, which is an RGB LED controller that allowed them to control in a really cool multiplexed way the color space within this cloud. And Nick had this kind of, at the time for us, bit harebrained idea that we should phone her up out of the blue and say, hey, let's make a piece. And so we set to work figuring out how to make something happen between our program, the TIFF Festival people, and Micah sitting in San Francisco. The goal of this project was to try to get students to think beyond the normal space of undergraduate production. Undergrads tend to have very small budgets, very complex timelines. They don't have a ton of time to commit to a project. So a lot of your undergraduate projects tend to be really small in scale, even though they're really, really imaginative. And we wanted to sort of disrupt that if we could. We also wanted to focus the makerspace as a site where big, cool things could happen, not just these tiny little projects. And this gave us a really great opportunity to go and partner with someone as big as TIFF and see what sort of outcomes might be able to grow from an experience like that. And also, at the time, we were learning who Micah was and discovering that she was this amazing person who was going to bring a really rich experience to our students. And I'm going to get David to drive the links here. So the piece we ended up making was called Forest. It was produced in 2015. It was part of the PlaySpace experience from about middle of February until April. It's a huge interactive wall, and I'm going to talk over top of the video as David kind of steers and plays it for you. So this massive wall, it's 8 feet tall, 16 feet wide, and each of these sort of circular areas has a handle in it that we call a spinner. And you could turn these spinners and color mix based on the position of the spinner. And all of the spinners across the surface of the wall could be changed simultaneously in real time. So a number of people coming into the wall and engaging with the surface could mix and cause to flow different color spaces throughout the wall as a whole. So each of these little panels, and here's just some time lapse of our building it, we engaged 25 volunteer students who gave a gazillion hours of their time. And while we were working on the material fabrication, Micah was doing all this crazy mad modeling of what the color space was going to look like and relating that into that fade candy technology that she'd already invented so that this experiential space could meet with that technological space, and we would create a surface that children could come and play with while their parents were buying movie tickets or waiting to get into the play space itself. Pardon me. So it lived, like it says, from March to April. Then it actually got held over for another month, which is a real success in the world of art. Having people keep your art for longer than they claim is always a good thing. So it was a really wonderful experience. I'll go back to the slides. I'm going to drive back to slides. So we got to the end of this experience, and there were a number of really awesome things while David searches for our slide deck here. Micah brought an incredible collection of skills and talent to the dialogue and the project we were trying to achieve. And the TIFF people proved to be super awesome collaborators. Here's some inside stuff. We have these big maps, just to give you a little bit of sense of what a production or a project looks like. Hundreds of little bits and pieces moving simultaneously. We're dealing with the material, actual fabrication and assembly to Micah's specs. So she's in San Francisco drawing designs and sending us stuff by email and Skype. We're building prototypes in Toronto and sending her video back of the outcomes of those experiments. She's doing all of the sort of behavioral work on her own little prototypes on her bench top. We're handling all the power stuff, the electronic stuff, and working with TIFF to figure out the logistics of actually installing this wall, which is huge and heavy. So they had to build a special wall to support our wall. So there's a whole collection of different sort of interactions and engagements going on. And the students were sort of inside all of those production processes as part of the experience. As I was saying, there's some really great and fantastic outcomes. One of the really big ones is the TIFF team put all of our students' names that volunteered their time on the wall as collaborators inside the gallery space. So this wasn't just about a whole bunch of student-free labor. This was about trying to create a space where student contributions were acknowledged as collaborative rather than just getting the job done and making the faculty look good or making the rest of the kind of players exist inside that space. So they told a little bit of that story in the gallery space. And we started to shift the thinking in the makerspace because students realized, you know, with a budget, yes, they don't have that, but with a budget and time and a good team, you can make really beautiful, big, amazing experiences happen. We started kind of thinking about what that is, and let's just give you a sense of what it looks like. Micah with her little mini spinners, literally a chunk of cardboard in San Francisco, and us trying to throw down real materials in Toronto and bringing those two worlds into play. She was brilliantly supportive. If you have a collaborator, she's sort of everything you ever want in a collaborative person, which is a really important part of making something like this happen. It was a great starting point for us because we really hadn't test-driven the makerspace in any way. We have all these tools, we had a facility, we've used them in our own practices, but we didn't know how we were going to implement those with students. We were also thinking really carefully about the fact that at the end of the day, our students were just fabrication assistants. And that was okay. That was a good first start. It worked really, really well, and they were well respected in that role, but we wanted to see if we could expand that role and bring in new and different opportunities to them. So we wanted to get student creativity and problem solving in earlier into the design process for big pieces like this. And we sort of, in the summer, we were reflecting. Forest was total chaos. We survived. It was a ton of work, and we were trying to think of, like, could we do that again? Did we want to do that again? And two opportunities sort of presented themselves simultaneously, and we took two slightly different strategies to see how we could maybe make stuff happen. One was another collaboration guided by Nick Paggi with TIFF, and the second one was a new collaborative space with the Science Centre, the Ontario Science Centre, that we were beginning to discuss and explore at that time. For the TIFF project, so this was now 2016, 15, 16, 16, we were looking at the potential of building another big tidal wall experience. So the same context as Forest, but a completely different piece. Again, Nick was curating the play space, and we went searching for partners. Nick had worked with Tangible Interaction, based in Vancouver. Alex Beam and his team. The year we did Forest, Tangible brought this piece called Visitor, and the year before we had made Forest, they had built this interactive LED experience as the tidal wall in the space. So we sort of crossed paths a little bit, but we'd never worked together. Nick again did Nick Paggi magic to kind of build and assemble this set of relationships among Tangible, New Media, and TIFF, and we again kind of set to work to build some sort of experience that students could be engaged in. Again, with the goal of sort of getting them in earlier. It had to be less materially intensive. Forest took like almost 1,000 hours to make, and it just about crushed us all into the dirt. So we needed something easier to pull off than that, but we also wanted a really strong experience where students could actually flex some of their own personal creative muscle. The piece we ended up building was Marshmallow Clouds, which is in the same space. Forest would have occupied kind of this area of the wall. TIFF builds a new facade and entranceway to the festival every year, so the structure of that shifts from time to time. But what we ended up building with Tangible was this collection of 9 clouds in the ceiling. The clouds are made out of Tyvek, and they're inflatable and have an LED RGB cube floating inside them. So they fill up and stay cloud-shaped for the duration of the show. There's a LiDAR sensor on the wall that you can't see in this photograph that's tracking the position of multiple people and keeping track of them. And as you moved underneath the clouds, the color of the clouds changed with you. So you could kind of dance back and forth and change the colorscape that was floating above your head inside that space. It was a real hit with kids. They would just run back and forth, which I think was a real hit with parents because they were standing in line trying to get tickets for the show or tickets to get into the play space. Again, embracing this sort of goal, a great partner, Tangible, was really open to taking what for them was kind of a risk of letting our students lead some part or engage in some part of the design process. And what they did is they had already invented these RGB cubes. Tangible does a lot of work with Blue Man Group and the Arcade Fire and a whole bunch of really big, spectacular contexts. So they were really used to working in a public context. They had this RGB network technology that they could stick inside the clouds. They knew that part would work. What they didn't know is how we were going to support all these pieces, power them, or inflate the clouds. And they handed those tasks off to our students. So they got to start to think about how they were going to integrate these bits and pieces. And the students then had the opportunity to go through different design iterations and pitch back their prototypes and go through some design cycles with Tangible. And once that got approval, they sort of went back into our makerspace and set up their production lines and produced, we ended up making a dozen of these different units, which had inflation and power supplies and suspension mechanisms that allowed the clouds not just to be installed, but also all of the internal electronics to function in the way that Tangible was envisioning for that interaction. So on install day, it's one of the real risky things. In the world of art galleries, you tend to not get a lot of time to do good user testing. You sort of show up and you kind of cross everything you can cross and hope that it works out well. So on this day was the first day we actually had more than one light cube that we could plug in. None of this had been tested, and we had like 24 hours to launch. So you kind of stand there and cross all of your fingers and hope you did a good job. We did have a fake cloud, and we got to kind of play with the design of the wall that would support the structure. So we sort of knew the illumination levels would be okay, but we had no real sense of what the interactive experience was going to be going into the space. On design day, that's Alex Beam, principal from Tangible Interaction. He worked with 2 of our students to assemble each of the clouds and test the clouds before they went up on the lift and were hung from the ceiling. They really embraced the idea that students should have a role very actively and early on in these stages. The outcome, again, was a really huge success for our students. You can get a sense of the piece overall. Again, TIFF were really stand-up partners and listed all of the names of the students as collaborators and designers in the project, along with Tangible. And the students that year actually got invited to the launch event, and they got to speak to the media as sort of ambassadors for the piece when the festival was launching. So it was a number, again, of really, really great successes in terms of trying to expand the context of how knowledge can be transmitted and reinforced and celebrated within an academic space by using our makerspace as sort of this catalyst location for introducing this very flat sort of level of information sharing rather than this lecture sort of structure. So the value of our makerspace was getting solidified. We'd had two really, really big successes. Marshmallow Clouds was happily well on its way and surviving down the road at the TIFF Lightbox. And at about the same time, we were halfway through this other process, and I'm going to hand off to David, and he's going to talk a little bit about the collaboration on the other side of things that was happening at the same time.
Thanks, Steve. So meanwhile, like Steve mentioned, while students were working on cloud, we had begun a relationship with a different partner. That actually came about. So the Ontario Science Centre happened to be touring Ryerson on the day we were working on Forest, the first project we shown you, and they walked by our makerspace and saw our students at work on the projects, and they didn't know about us before. And just from seeing the work, we had this conversation that began with them about eventually working together to create some kind of collaborative experience for our students. So this took us to the Science Center. This is a couple of our students on the field trip, marveling at this David Rockaby piece. And so I'll talk a little bit about the timeline here because this matters for this particular project. So this was kind of a first try at doing more of a hybrid volunteer and curriculum kind of activity. So the other two projects we talked about, they were all extracurricular. Students were just volunteering their time on these projects. So for the Science Center project, we sat down and kind of envisioned this model that would allow people to participate as volunteers, but also as students taking a course, and also be a space where faculty and staff are also contributing as partners on the project. So really this kind of hybrid volunteer curriculum model. So we had a year long to work on this. And this was kind of the different phases of the project we had. In the fall of 2015, we started with this field trip to the Science Center. Most of our students hadn't been there since they were little kids, and some of them were from out of town that were not familiar. So that was open to just the school at large and even people from other programs. We ended up taking 30 students on the bus to the Science Center just to do some exploration. We followed up that field trip with a couple of brainstorm sessions that was also open to anyone who wanted to participate. We had a few grad students come to those, but mainly undergrads, mainly from the New Media program, but also from other programs. And these sessions were led by our Science Center mentors, and then with Steve and myself. And I'll talk about who the mentors were in a second. But essentially, students were provided with a number of really broad kind of design directions. And one of those was improving visitor engagement at the Science Center. These were things that the Science Center internally were interested in working on, and they just did that problem to students. So through the brainstorm session, students developed an idea, which eventually got moved into a course in the winter. We had 21 students take that elective course, and those students worked on the implementation of the project. They developed a prototype, which was presented at the end of the course. And then our model kind of moved over into the summer, accounting for the fact that our undergraduate students are just disappearing over the summer. The role of sort of polishing, refining, and taking the project to completion ended up to sort of faculty and staff. So kind of a handover happened at the end of the course into the summer, where it essentially became my project. We did have a student intern, and students were asked to volunteer if they wanted to, but most of them have summer jobs and things they have to do in the summer. So it really had this kind of handover. And then eventually we installed in July of 2016. So this was a much longer timeline and this sort of hybrid model. So I'll talk a little bit about what the project, okay, so the goals were, again, we wanted to make sure students could become creators and partners, not just implementers, and really have a lot of ownership in the ideas. make sure the students could follow an iterative design process, which is hard to do in undergraduate courses, where they often have really tight timelines to deliver their projects. So we wanted to make sure that they could go through that process. Student experience was a priority. From the get-go, our partners at the Science Center were very clear, and we were very clear about this. This was not kind of a shortcut to get new projects on the floor of the Science Center or sort of cheap labor in the way of students making new experiences. This was this was a new mode of engagement for the Ontario Science Center. So their primary audience is kids, but they're also thinking about how can they engage with university level students. And this was one way for them to do this, by supporting this course and providing mentorship. And the outcomes were really a bonus. If we did make a project that worked and that survived this environment, that was cherry on top, but it was almost inconsequential. We were allowed to fail if it came to it, and that was really important to us. And of course, continued reliance on the makerspace. So our two mentors, we work really closely with, were really supportive. Kevin Von Appen, who's Director of Science Communication, and Sabrina Grupner, who manages the Weston Family Innovation Center. So in response to increasing visitor engagement, this is a project the students came up with. It was called Bitmorph, and there's lots of different components, but in a nutshell, the idea was to have these podiums. So this is one of 6, and each podium has a card dispenser, and these are what the cards look like. Also has a card reader over here and a little pseudo holographic display inside. And the idea is these podiums were scattered in the different zones of the Science Center. And we wanted to encourage visitors to have a fun experience while they were going through the museum and seeing other exhibits. So you could grab a card, scan it, and each card was unique. And visitors would then get greeted with a little 8-bit animated egg character who would hatch, and then they would get a randomly generated creature out of that egg. And the game was essentially to find the other podiums in the Science Center. Every time they would scan their card at a new podium, their creature would grow a little bit until it reached full development and gained some accessories and so forth. So they had 6 possible stages of development, all of those randomly generated from this asset pool. And so that was kind of the main drive, so kind of getting kids on this bit of a scavenger hunt and encouraging them to explore areas they might otherwise miss. The secondary goal to that was also we got lots of interesting data about how people visit the Science Center just by looking at the scans and being able to track cards throughout the day. And students could also, visitors could also then go online back home if they held onto their cards. They could see the creature they had grown or developed through that installation, and that would give them links back to the Science Center content based on. So if you went to these 3 different zones to get your creature, you had these links back to Science Center content and videos to kind of encourage people to revisit at home online later on. So that was a bit more famous. So what I'll do now is just talk a little bit about some of the process we went through to develop this project. So like I said, it was an iterative design process, really focused on students coming up with prototypes early on and then presenting them to Science Center mentors and then iterating on those prototypes. This is Kevin here and Sabrina in one of her class, and the students are talking about ideas they had around the display using acrylic and a screen. So these are very early first prototypes. These are students thinking through some challenges around accessibility for that unit and scale, and thinking about, okay, well, what if I'm a small child? Is there a way for me to climb up and see the display, and can you access it from different angles? Just using models and rough prototypes. Students then that was moved on to a second stage where they were just framing. This one was to scale, so it was the right size, but obviously missing lots of components. These are early prototypes of the card readers that were using Raspberry Pis and cameras to read the QR codes. At the end of the course, this was how the final prototypes looked like. Students built 2 functional units. They had 2 towers, and they got to install them in a separate room at the Science Center, where we invited 75 member families to come to the event. and basically act as as a user testers for this installation. Students got to take notes and evaluate and just observe how people interacted with the project. So this is as far as we took it at the end of the course. Then we moved on to more of a refinement phase. We were able to hire one student intern because of our budget. We had a few people stick around as volunteers, where we had to then take 2 prototypes, replicate them, build 4 more in order to complete the experience, and then just do a whole lot of painting and sanding and painting, more sanding, and a few software tweaks, all the way to the units being delivered at the Science Center in July 2016. All right. So the project went on to live on the floor for 5 weeks, and which was quite a feat actually in terms of the robustness of the platform that the students developed. The Science Center is a very punishing environment for any kind of interactive exhibit, especially in the summer where it's one of their peak times. They get lots and lots of visitors. With a bit more of over 5 weeks, 27,000 unique characters were created, so that's 27,000 cards went through the installation, but there was over 100,000 scans overall. So the Science Center internally ran an evaluation on that installation, the way they would evaluate any other project that goes on their floor. And they did find it to be mutually beneficial, so it was not only was a great experience for the students, it was also good for the guests. And the Science Center themselves learned some insights on how to engage with that age group, right, the university student age group. Scale was a little bit on the ambitious side. Much like Forest, we are asking ourselves whether or not these collaborations are sustainable in the long term, because they do take up a lot of effort from faculty to put together. Yes, and like the other projects, students were credited on the podium itself. They were also featured in news media coverage of the project and interviews, so they got to get some profile from participating in this as well. So this is some of our current students. So we are, the 4th project we'll talk about is a bit more of a work in progress, so they're currently working on it, so we don't have too many details yet. But the first collaboration with the Science Center was a success, so we're running the same course again this year with them. The timeline is a little bit different because the course happens in the fall instead of the winter, so we don't have the luxury of a full year. But in a way it works out for this new context we have. So the Science Center is the same partner, but the context is a little bit different. So since we started all these things, the makerspace idea has really become quite mainstream. There's lots of makerspaces around town now, and the Science Center themselves are really tapping into this concept. One of their newest areas they've launched is the space called the Inventorium, where they partnered with local makerspaces and this coffee shop called Maker Bean, where all of the exhibits in that area are very much informed by maker spirit and aesthetics. So they're quick prototypes that are meant to live on the floor for just a few weeks and then get retired, and then new other ideas are coming in. And all the activities are very hands-on, and visitors are asked to be creative while playing with these activities, not just be passive learners of science. So this is their kind of newest area that they are investing a lot of time and effort into. And this is where our students are working this term. So we have a class doing 4 different projects for this space. So another group of 20 or so students developing projects for the Inventorium, following the same curricular arc we used for a bit more, but just a different outcome. But these projects will also go on and live in the Inventorium for a little while at the end of term. So the goals are the same, similar student experience, empowering students being a big factor, empowering them to be creators. This time around, the students have 100% ownership over the ideas. The only design brief they have is their project has to fit within the Inventorium concept, which is pretty broad. The scale is a little bit smaller, and we're also trying to shift the responsibilities of evaluating the projects onto the students. So they will have to do an evaluation much like what the Science Center normally does to their internal exhibits, unlike with Bitmore, it is a little bit lighter. The other different connection we have with this project is the Science Center also has a science school where grade 12 students go and study at the Science Center for a term. And we are connecting our students with these high school students who are also working in the inventorium space, designing prototypes. So they're going to be acting as mentors for each other's projects. So this is our current endeavor. All right. Okay. So just for review, right, we started with a makerspace in about 2013. We built on some existing relationships, new relationships, to start developing public works, showing our first one in 2015, Forest. And since then, we've been really using this makerspace idea as a site to strengthen our student community, engage our students, and create exciting collaboration opportunities. All right. So you want to jump in, talk about some of the takeaways? Okay. We'll continue. Okay, so some of the lessons we've learned. I'm not going to read through all of this, but just highlight some of the those points here. A big point here is building trust. We spent a lot of time making sure that these projects not only meet the goals of the students, but also meet the goals of the partners we're working with. So making sure we navigate this properly was really key to our success. Making sure we have great opportunities for students to engage. Students really we're craving meaningful roles in these projects, not just being implementers, so making sure that we tap into their creative input, and I think we're slowly learning how to do this properly. Having great partners really helps. All the partners we've had on these projects were very open to collaboration and also really committed to making sure that the collaborative process was unfolding properly. Having, of course, a strong core of people also committed to that idea, so strong alumni like Nick Paggi, Ashley Lewis, who's our staff member, is really instrumental. But then also creating a space, so our makerspace, and where we embody production and synergy and make sure that those are core values of that space. So it's not just saying, here's a place for you to work, but really showing the students what the potential of that space can be. Making sure we seed the space or provide enough projects to exist in that space to make that point. And then finally, the idea that knowledge sharing can be a community-based, flat transfer between peers, not necessarily only top-down lecturing. And this is especially interesting to us in the university context. A few additional outcomes as well. I'm being mindful of time. I do want to open it to questions shortly. Since we've started doing these projects, we do have a strong makerspace leader in our colleague Ashley. We've started to see a lot of new programs come up, grassroots initiatives by our students that are starting to embed themselves in that space. Our students are doing Get Good, which is peer workshops. They're teaching each other skills. They're doing show and tell night. We have Hack Night, which is an open studio. We have Code Coaches, which is this network of students mentoring each other on programming and tangible electronics. So really this idea of community-based learning is developing along these projects. And we're kind of reflecting on the idea that the makerspace is a site where everyone is an expert. Everyone is good at something. It's also a site where beginners can be successful. You don't have to. Everyone is an expert at something, and if you're not, this is a place where you can succeed if you work together as a community. So we're really starting to ask ourselves, how can we better take advantage of this ethos in the university context, right? What does that mean for undergraduate student learners to come in a university program, and how can we supplement their courses that they're getting with this type of community-based learning experience? And so, any thoughts? Or at this point, I'm happy to open it up to questions, reflections, maybe, discussion.
Time for questions. You guys self-moderate. So, are there any questions?
Are you taking transfer students into your program?
We should talk separately. You actually don't, but you definitely welcome to apply and come visit us. Yes.
Just wondering, so it seems that the team for all of your projects are pretty big, involving like more than 20 students. Just wondering what your design process would be, given that you have such a team. Does everyone contribute, and how do you kind of allocate time for each of them to speak up?
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's varied from project to project. Starting with, Forest was very much an exercise in just coordinating volunteers to come in and pitch in whenever they had time to work on some of the more manual intensive tasks of building the installation. Whereas in that project, Steve and I did a lot more of the problem solving. So we had this really elaborate schedule system, and some students would drop in for an hour here, 2 hours there, and then making sure staff helps us keeping it all together. Make sure people can contribute whenever they had time. Some of the other projects, it depended on the project. So Bitmore, for example, we ran very much the way we would run a small company working on a design brief. So we had 21 students, and then that's subdivided into smaller teams. They had different areas of focus. We had a team doing the design of the physical design of the structure. We had a team doing the back end. We had a team doing the front end of the website. We had another team designing the creatures and the content. We had a team designing the card reader, a team focused only on the display. So these were about 3 students each. And they all came together every week, and we had these company meetings where people would report back, and then we would go back into their respective teams. And my role was to make sure I was basically a project manager and making sure everyone was doing what they were supposed to be doing, and that people were talking to each other when they had to make sure the integration when it happened, and we had enough time to do that as well.
Can I just jump in there?
Yeah.
The other thing that we've noticed that happens is when the students start designing the elements themselves rather than just sort of completing tasks for others, their ownership of the project really shifts. And so their commitment into those spaces is really different. When the student's trying to solve the problem that they created for themselves by saying, let's have a hologram character, that's really different than us saying, go make a hologram. Right? And so the responsibility and sort of the commitment level really has shifted as we sort of work our way across these projects. The first one is amazing that we somehow extracted 700 to 1,000 hours of help out of people. That was really just the enthusiasm coming from Micah and other people. In the later projects, as the students are kind of going, this is my thing, even though their names were on all those other projects, the ownership of the idea really shifts their willingness to invest and their sort of commitment to the outcome. So it's a really important part of this space.
I think your second project, the one where you had the multiple phases, like the field trip and then the brainstorm, how many students were kind of involved in like consecutive parts of it, and how did you leverage having like different people in different parts, and how did that kind of contribute to the whole collaboration aspect that you guys were going for?
That's a good question. We had a core of 21, in the middle, we had the 21 students who took the course, who were the most invested. Of these 21 students, not everyone came to the brainstorm or even to the field trip. So I would say we had about 15 of them who went to everything. And then in the process, we lost some students who didn't take the course, or they had schedule conflict, or they just didn't want to go on and build it. They were only interested in the ideas in the beginning. And then we had some new students who came in who had missed the brainstorms. Maybe they didn't pay attention when that was being advertised, and then through word of mouth, they were like, oh, this is actually interesting, I want to contribute. We had one student in particular who went on to be our summer intern on the project. He came in the middle of the course with little to no background, and it was up to his peers to catch him up, essentially. We had a quick little recap at the beginning of the course of the work that had been done before. But we timed it in a way that it was, so the brainstorm had finished, we had a concept, but we had lots of open-ended questions for the students to resolve in the course as to the actual specific design and what it would look like and what it would do. So it was easy for a student to come in and jump in the project at that point. Like I would expect probably most other projects that are happening working for a firm or something like this, where you have different people doing the design up front and then passing it on to an implementation group.
I have a question. Yes, so I completely agree with what you said about ownership and the importance of kind of giving students the opportunity to have kind of creative say in the work on the problem-solving aspects of the project, and that really increases the ownership and the sense that this is their project and that they really want to put the effort in. At the same time, I've found from my own experience that when you do that, then often you end up in a sort of very lengthy, prolonged conceptual design phase. So what are the strategies that you use to make sure that the conceptual design doesn't go on in a never-ending way, and that you actually push forward and leave enough time for the implementation, because you're obviously building things that need to be robust and are going to be used by thousands of people at the Science Center?
Fear.
Here is a great strategy to make sure it moves forward. And then this applied more to the Science Center project, so a bit more if we had two brainstorm sessions, two separate ones, and one building on the other one. And I think where we came in is we acted as, we had a little bit of editorial say as to what the direction the ideas would take. So we let students come up with the concepts and the ideas, but they had way more than was feasible to do, and it was going in all kinds of different directions. And where we came in was to help them narrow it down a little bit and nudge them in directions we thought had potential. So say, okay, you have this board of 100 ideas, and then because we have a little bit more experience than them, we can stare at that board and say, okay, let's take that one and that one and that one and run with this. It was still their ideas, but we helped them narrow it down. Yeah. And for the second course, it was the same process. We got even less time for this one, make sure students come up with concepts like they're working on right now, and they all have their ideas. I've asked them to do journal entries on their own while we were just visiting and brainstorming, and then I went through their entries, picked out the key ideas, and then presented them back to the students. So their own ideas, we presented to them saying, here's the 4 projects we're going to focus on based on what you guys have come up with. Otherwise, yes, it could take much longer for them to narrow it down and eventually get started. So we cut to the chase a little bit by saying, okay, we have lots of potential, let's go that way. We could do all of these projects, but why don't we try this one this time? So.
Structurally within the course too, there's lots of short deadline presentations. So each iteration has to get pitched, and the Science Center was really, really generous on that. They came several times. Yes. We had other faculty members bring in their kids so we could kind of user test with the right audience. But it just meant David had to kind of stay on top of them and make sure they always had a deliverable sort of hanging in front of them, so that you don't kind of go, 12 weeks from now we're going to do something, and on like week 11 everyone starts. So lots of stuff, little hurdles and challenges. And then the team sort of, within each team, they sort of police themselves, as it were, right? If you have someone who's not participating in the space, they either boot them or drag them along. So this kind of peer pressure inside that space as well, that works to your advantage in this context.
Any more questions?
Yes.
Oh, yep.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about any challenges you ran into setting up and then sort of running the makerspace. Like, did it all just go really smoothly, or were there issues with like safety or like stuff going missing or getting damaged?
We're still setting it up, so it's an ongoing process. When did we get our first aid kit? Was it last year?
I'm not supposed to admit that.
How many times have you used it?
As we allude to, we have an alumni who has worked in makerspace contexts, but also has sort of just a vast amount of experience, who was hired as staff before the makerspace became a thing, and she naturally evolved. It was a really good fit. So she brings a lot of outside experience into that space. But the rest of it is just sort of continuous evaluation, because we're always bringing new tools and techniques into the space, and they all get safety audited. There's all kinds of stuff that goes with it. So training gets specified either through coursework or workshops. We try to have access to the tools through community pathways as well as curricular pathways, so that you don't have to take a course to use the tool. Hopefully the course gives you a more in-depth understanding of the potentials of that space, but everybody that way can potentially gain access if they're willing to commit to the workshop schedule. But there's lots of wrinkles, and what we try to do is listen really well to the students when they say, whoa, this is ridiculous or too complex or too much or not enough. and be responsive to those kinds of demands as they pop up.
Just to add to that a little bit, to be clear, our space is not it's not fancy at all. It's a room with reconfigurable tables, and it's more of the spirit of it that we're interested in, the spirit of makerspaces and the way people approach their spaces and the way that they work. So we try to replicate that in our production facilities, and that can work on a very low-tech environment with very few resources, all the way to a really fancy makerspace. It's more about that ethos and that way of working that we're investigating. So. Yes.
This is really cool, especially in the context of an undergraduate program.
Yes.
I'm just curious, can you say something about what people did for the students did to struggle between different courses that they have? Because this seems like very interesting and probably very time consuming at the same time, and something that people want to do, but how do they deal with other courses, and is there any frustrations or things that you help them with?
I don't know that I caught all of that. Sorry, I should have told everyone before, I'm almost completely deaf and I wear hearing aids and read lips, so I didn't actually hear the question, so I need David to help me out here.
That really hasn't been an issue that much. Our other courses in the program also tend to be fairly open-ended as well, so we have lots of project-based courses. I think students have risen to the occasion. We haven't had, at least so far, that hasn't been an issue. In terms of, and some students have contributed more than others based on what amount of time they were able to put in, and we're respectful of that and mindful. We try to be. It's a good question.
Right.
Yes.
Do you think makerspaces will help contribute to more permanent types of installations in community spaces?
What do you mean by that?
So a lot of these projects, basically, you have to remove them for a while, I guess, because the maintenance is difficult, and like you said, at the science center, the children probably, moving a lot of parts and stuff, so things like break. So what is the feasibility of more permanent type projects?
That's a good question, actually, and we've had a few, not I wouldn't say offers, but discussions around these types of projects, and we've on purpose stayed away from that. And really, like you said, because of the logistics, once we're more interested in the process of getting to the project than the outcome, and having a permanent thing, while it's nice to have it stick around, the maintenance and support it requires to keep these types of installations alive is pretty staggering usually, and compounds over the years. And Steve and I also want to have a life and do other things, so we're actually quite glad that these projects come down after they've been created, and sadly kind of end up in the graveyard of projects. We don't have room to store them or keep them, but we're okay with that. The outcomes, like we said, in a bit more of a if there's a great outcome that works, that's fantastic, but we're more focusing on the journey to get there in the process.
So any thoughts on the differences between like college makerspace and like some community-based, but like, so a lot of participants are actually from society, not from like undergrad programs. So any thoughts on like what's your focus and what's the differences between those?
Did you get that question?
I think the really, really big difference you've kind of already hit on is like the demographic. Because we're not a public facility, the people who are coming into our space are probably a lot more homogenous, at least in terms of their interests and their thinking, than people who are interested in being in a fine art technology-based program. So most of our student body is already kind of pointing in that direction. I think public makerspaces act as a really important site of discovery for people who don't have access to some of those tools. Because we're either assuming or hoping that our students have already gone through that discovery phase and they're in kind of an investment space, that we're there more to facilitate sort of and enrich their opportunities to get a deeper understanding of some of those spaces, while working with each other, but also in a guided sort of university context. So there's a philosophy kind of side of that exploration and community knowledge sharing, but there also is a really different kind of community that we're talking about inside our space. Yes?
So one thing I found with a lot of the makerspaces was that there seems to be a barrier. So what I would best describe as a barrier of entry, such that basically it's difficult for makerspaces to become accepted by the mainstream. And from my experience with makerspaces, a lot of them have mostly remained semi-underground, as in they're known to people who actually follow those things, but actively publicizing it outside of the maker community is a challenge. Right. So I'd like to ask, A, how do you why do you think this is a challenge, and B, how do you intend on circumventing this?
That's a really great question. I don't know if I can answer both of them. It's a really part of a really big question for me, and it's one that we kind of wrestle with a lot, and it really has to do with kind of cultural expectations and structures around what we think of as technology. Makerspaces tend to be really technologically oriented organizations and spaces. They're kind of access points to a whole bunch of tools that a lot of people don't have at home. So the people who are kind of oriented towards them already have like this accessibility, but getting people to engage with technological spaces when they're not already oriented in that way is a bit of a challenge. Within our own space, I mean, part of these projects exist precisely because we wanted to break down the what is a makerspace question. We wanted to create opportunities within our space that students could see big positive outcomes coming out of it. So they, as kind of points of departure for their own imagination once they got to that space. Like David said, our makerspace is really quite simple. It's probably smaller than the room we're standing in. It achieves what it does because the people who come into it are prepared to take risks and explore and support each other and make things happen. How do you get that to happen at a societal level? I don't know that I have like an off the top of my head question. If I did, it would solve so many problems in my life. Because the struggle of how do you get people to engage with technology is sort of one of the driving things of our program. It's one of those questions we're perpetually asking, especially in a fine art context, which isn't necessarily thought of as a technological space. So how do you invite people into the spaces is a really, really big puzzle. We've been trying to answer it for 10 or 14 years, the time we've been at Ryerson, and I don't know that we really have all of that kind of figured out. It's a work in progress, just like the space.
I think that's about all the time we have for questions. So that's
Thanks so much for all your questions.
Thank you.